I wasn't looking for another woman. That's the truth. The one I told myself in the sterile echo of my new empty apartment. The boxes, monuments to a life hastily dismantled, stood like silent accusers in the corners. Each one was sealed with packing tape and a layer of grief so thick I could feel it in the air, a cloying humidity that had nothing to do with the September rain streaking down the oversized windows. I wasn't looking for love or connection or even a friend. I was looking for a fortress, a place with four walls and a locked door where I could bleed out the poison of Sarah's betrayal in peace. A roommate was a necessary evil, a financial concession to the reality of city living and the sudden halving of my income. The ad had been simple. Quiet professional seeks same, non-smoker, must be clean. I'd interviewed 3 people via a soulless video call, my own face a pale, strained mask on the screen. I chose the one who seemed the least likely to try and talk to me. Lena. Her voice on the call had been a low, calm melody. Her answers concise. Her smile brief but genuine. She seemed contained, self-sufficient, perfect. The reality of her, standing in the doorway now, was something my laptop screen had failed to convey. She was taller than I'd thought, with broad shoulders that tapered to a narrow waist. She wore a simple gray t-shirt and worn jeans, but they hung on her frame with an artist's casual grace. Her hair was a cloud of tight, beautiful coils, and her skin was the color of rich, dark coffee, smooth and deep. But it was her eyes that held me. They were dark, yes, but not flat. They were full of a startling, intelligent stillness, as if she were taking in not just the room, not just the mess of my half-unpacked life, but the very frequency of the air between us. "Chloe?" she asked, and her voice was even warmer in person, a low hum that vibrated in my sternum. I'd been staring. I felt a flush of heat creep up my neck. "Yeah, hi, Lena." I wiped a sweaty palm on my jeans and gestured vaguely into the chaos. "Welcome to the disaster zone." She smiled, and it was the same brief, genuine curve of her lips from the video call, but up close, I could see the way it made the corners of her eyes crinkle. "It's just stuff. It finds a place eventually." She hefted a duffel bag higher on her shoulder and held up a cardboard box with "kitchen, fragile," scrawled on the side in neat architectural letters. "My room is the one at the end of the hall?" "Yeah, it's a room." My attempt at a joke landed with a thud. I was out of practice with casual human interaction. For the last 6 months of my life with Sarah, every word had been a negotiation, a potential landmine. Silence had been safer. Lena didn't seem to notice my social atrophy. She just nodded. "Good. That's what I was hoping for." She moved past me, and I was hit with her scent. It wasn't perfume. It was something more integral, like the smell of her skin itself. Sandalwood and a faint, clean hint of bergamot. It was grounding, earthy. It was the opposite of Sarah's sharp floral fragrances that always seemed designed to announce her presence before she even entered a room. The scent lingered in the air after Lena passed, a quiet question mark in the stale atmosphere of my grief. I stood there for a long moment, my hands still tingling from the imagined handshake I'd failed to offer, and felt the first, unwelcome crack in the foundation of my new fortress. I wasn't looking for another woman, but one had just walked through my door, smelling of sandalwood and quiet capability, and my body, that traitorous vessel of memory and want, had already taken notice. The first week was a carefully choreographed dance of avoidance. I learned her schedule through sound alone. The soft click of her bedroom door at 6:30, the low rumble of the coffee grinder, the whisper of her sneakers on the hardwood as she left for a run. I'd wait until I heard the front door latch before emerging from my own room. A ghost. In my own home. I unpacked my life in silence, placing books on shelves and folding clothes into drawers with a mechanical precision that kept the memories at bay. I was determined to make this work, to coexist as two ships passing in the night, sharing nothing but a mailing address and a Wi-Fi password. I would be the perfect invisible roommate. Lena, however, was not invisible. She was quietly, infuriatingly present. She didn't pry or push. She simply existed in the space with a calm that felt like a judgment on my own frantic internal chaos. She left a small, vibrant green succulent on the kitchen windowsill. She replaced the harsh, buzzing light bulb in the hallway with a softer, warmer one. She'd leave a second mug of coffee on the counter in the morning, a silent, steaming offering I pointedly ignored until it was cold. Each small act of domestic grace felt like a stone being tossed against the glass walls I had so carefully constructed around myself. "You know, you can talk to me," she said one evening. I was standing at the counter, spooning yogurt into a bowl for what I considered dinner, my back rigid. I hadn't even heard her come into the kitchen. I flinched, my spoon clattering against the ceramic. "I'm not a big talker." "I've noticed." Her voice was dry but not unkind. I could feel her presence behind me, a warm, solid shape in the periphery. "I just wanted to say, the coffee isn't a trap. It's just coffee. Sometimes I make too much." I scraped the last of the yogurt out of the container, my knuckles white. "Fine, thanks." The words were clipped, rude. I wanted her to be annoyed. I wanted her to retreat, to decide I was a lost cause and leave me to my misery. Instead, she was silent for a moment. I risked a glance over my shoulder. She was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed over her chest. Her expression wasn't angry or hurt. It was assessing. That unnerving stillness was back in her eyes, as if she were looking at a complex puzzle and patiently identifying the pieces. "Okay," she said, her voice soft. "Well, if you need anything, I'll be in my room." She turned and walked away, the sound of her footsteps retreating down the hall. I was left alone in the silent kitchen, my heart hammering against my ribs. Her patience was worse than any argument. It gave me nothing to push against, no justification for my bitterness. It simply held up a mirror to my own behavior, and I didn't like the reflection. I hated her for it. And what I hated even more was the small, treacherous part of me that felt a pang of something other than anger. A flicker of shame, a whisper of loneliness so profound it almost buckled my knees. I wanted her to leave me alone, but I was terrified that she actually would. The storm rolled in on a Saturday, a bruised purple mass of clouds that swallowed the afternoon sun whole. I was curled on the sofa, wrapped in a blanket, pretending to read a book while actually replaying the final ugly argument with Sarah in my head for the 1,000th time. The first clap of thunder was a low growl that vibrated through the floorboards. The second was a violent crack that made the windows rattle in their frames. Then, the lights flickered once, twice, and died, plunging the apartment into a sudden, disorienting twilight. A moment later, the hum of the refrigerator and the soft glow of the Wi-Fi router also vanished. Silence descended, thick and absolute, broken only by the drumming of rain against the glass. "Well, hell," a voice said from the hallway. Lena appeared in the doorway of the living room, a silhouette against the faint gray light from her own window. "You okay?" "I'm fine," I said, my voice tight. My fortress had just lost its electricity, its internet, its primary defenses against the outside world. I felt a surge of irrational panic. "I've got candles," she said, her voice calm and practical, "and a camp stove for coffee, and a bottle of whiskey that might come in handy." She disappeared and returned a few minutes later, her arms full. The scent of wax and sulfur filled the air as she lit 3 thick pillar candles, placing them on the coffee table. The flickering light threw dancing shadows on the walls, transforming our generic apartment into something intimate and strange. It softened the hard edges of the room and of her face. I watched the way the flame light caught the high curve of her cheekbones and the deep, rich color of her eyes. She moved with an unhurried efficiency that was both captivating and infuriating. While I was frozen with a vague, formless anxiety, she was already solving the problem. She set up the small camp stove on the kitchen counter, the hiss of the gas a comforting sound in the quiet. The rich, dark smell of brewing coffee soon followed. It was a scent I was beginning to associate with her, with a kindness I hadn't earned and didn't know how to accept. "Whiskey and yours?" she called from the kitchen. "No, thanks." She came back with 2 steaming mugs and handed one to me. Our fingers brushed as I took it. Her skin was warm, her touch brief, but it sent a jolt up my arm that was entirely unwelcome. It was the first time we'd touched. I curled my fingers around the hot ceramic, focusing on the sensation to distract myself from the other, more complicated one. She settled into the armchair opposite the sofa, tucking her legs beneath her. She wasn't looking at me, but at the rain lashing against the window. The silence stretched, but it felt different now. Less like a wall, and more like a space waiting to be filled. "So," she said, her voice low, "what do you do when you're not haunting this apartment like a tragic Victorian ghost?" The question was so unexpected, so bluntly gentle, that a laugh escaped me before I could stop it. It sounded rusty, foreign. "I'm a graphic designer," I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. "I work from home, hence the haunting." "Ah," she nodded, taking a sip of her coffee. "I'm an illustrator, mostly children's books." "That's nice." It was a lame response, but it was all I had. "It pays the bills," she said with a small shrug. "And I like drawing monsters." She smiled, that quick, genuine smile that lit up her whole face. "What kind of design?" And just like that, we were talking. I told her about my corporate clients, the soulless logos and sterile branding guides I created. She told me about the characters she was working on for her latest project, a grumpy badger and a perpetually optimistic squirrel. She talked about her process, the feel of a certain kind of paper, the specific weight of a pencil in her hand. I found myself watching her hands as she spoke, her long, elegant fingers gesturing to sketch her ideas in the air. I noticed the faint smudges of graphite on her thumb and the small, pale callus on her middle finger where her pencil rested. It was a detail so specific, so intimate, it felt like I was learning a secret. Hours passed. The candles burned lower. The rain never stopped. We talked about books and bad television in the city. We never ventured into personal territory, keeping to the safe, shallow waters of opinions and tastes, but it was the most I had spoken to anyone in months. I felt a strange loosening in my chest, a knot I hadn't even realized was there beginning to unfurl. She didn't ask me why I was so sad. She didn't offer platitudes or try to fix me. She just sat there in the flickering candlelight and treated me like a person who liked old movies and hated cilantro, not just a collection of wounds. At some point, she got up and came back with a sketchbook and a piece of charcoal. "Mind if I?" she asked, gesturing vaguely toward me. I shook my head, suddenly self-conscious. She sat back down and began to draw, her eyes flicking up to my face, then back down to the page. The only sound was the scratching of charcoal on paper and the steady drumming of the rain. I tried not to move, tried to arrange my face into something neutral. But being looked at by her, really looked at, was an intensely vulnerable experience. Her gaze wasn't invasive. It was focused, curious, and deeply attentive. I felt seen in a way that was both terrifying and, to my shame, thrilling. My fortress was dark, the drawbridge was down, and an artist was sitting in my living room, mapping my face by candlelight. The power came back on the following Tuesday, but the electricity that had sparked between us in the darkness lingered. The apartment felt smaller, the air in the hallway thicker. We fell into a new tentative routine. We stopped avoiding each other. instead orbiting in a careful, respectful dance. We started leaving our bedroom doors slightly ajar, an unspoken invitation. Some evenings we'd cook together, moving around the small kitchen with a growing familiarity, our elbows brushing, our hands reaching for the same utensil. Each accidental touch was a small firework, a brief, startling burst of awareness that left my skin tingling long after she'd moved away. I was unpacking the last box of sentimental junk one afternoon. It was the one I'd been avoiding, the one full of photographs and ticket stubs, the archaeology of a shared life. I knew it was a bad idea, but some part of me needed to perform the final exorcism. I was sitting on my bedroom floor, surrounded by the ghosts of holidays and birthdays, when I picked it up. A framed photo from 2 years ago, taken at the beach. Sarah and I, squinting into the sun, her arms slung around my shoulders, both of us laughing. In the picture, we looked happy, invincible. The lie of it, the carefully curated memory, hit me like a physical blow. The woman in that photo had been sleeping with her married boss for our entire final year together. The laughter was a performance. The love was a lie. A sob tore its way out of my chest, raw and ugly. I dropped the frame as if it had burned me, the glass shattering on the hardwood floor. And then I couldn't stop. The grief I had been bottling up for months, the humiliation, the rage, the profound aching loss. It all came pouring out. I wrapped my arms around my knees and wept, my body shaking with the force of it. I didn't hear her come in. I just felt a presence, and then a gentle weight settled on the bed beside me. I looked up through a blur of tears. Lena was sitting there, her expression soft with a concern that wasn't pity. She didn't say anything. She didn't offer a tissue or a meaningless platitude. She just sat, a quiet, solid anchor in the storm of my sorrow. Her silence was a gift. It created a space where my grief could simply exist, without judgment or the need for explanation. After a few minutes, my sobs subsided into ragged, hiccuping breaths. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "You shouldn't have to see this." "There's nothing to be sorry for," she said, her voice a low murmur. She finally looked down at the shattered picture frame on the floor. "Was that her?" I nodded, unable to speak. "It looks like it was a happy memory." "It wasn't real," I choked out. "None of it was." And then I told her. I told her everything. The little lies that became big ones. The gaslighting that made me question my own sanity. The discovery of the emails, the final brutal confrontation. I told her how I hadn't just lost a partner. I'd lost my best friend, my home, my future, and my own sense of judgment. I told her how I couldn't trust anyone, least of all myself. I confessed that I hadn't been with a man in over a decade, that this world, the world of loving women, was the only one I knew, and it had just been scorched to the ground. When I was finished, my throat raw, the silence returned. Lena reached out, not to touch me, but to pick up the largest shard of glass from the floor. She held it carefully in her palm. "Sometimes," she said, her voice incredibly soft, "things have to break completely before you can see what they were really made of." She didn't tell me I'd be okay. She didn't say I'd find someone else. She just acknowledged the break. And in that moment, sitting on the floor amidst the wreckage of my past, her quiet validation felt more healing than any promise ever could. She stood up, went to the kitchen, and came back with a dustpan and a mug of tea, sweetened exactly how I liked it. A few nights later, we were making pasta, the kitchen filled with the smell of garlic and basil and the comfortable silence of two people who no longer needed to fill the space with noise. The air between us had changed since my breakdown. The tentative respect had deepened into a fragile trust. I felt less like a ghost and more like a person again, albeit a bruised and wary one. I was chopping tomatoes while Lena stirred the sauce, her back to me. I found myself watching the way the muscles in her shoulders moved beneath her t-shirt, the focused, steady rhythm of her stirring. "You know," she said, her voice casual, not turning around. "You never asked me why I needed a roommate so suddenly." It was true. I had been so consumed by my own drama that I hadn't given her story a single thought. I felt a flush of shame. "I'm sorry, I just assumed. I don't know. It's okay." She finally turned, leaning back against the counter, a wooden spoon in her hand. "It wasn't anything dramatic like yours. No shattering glass or secret affairs." Her mouth quirked into a small, wry smile. "It was quieter, more boring." She told me about Maya. They had been together for 4 years. They had built a life, adopted a cat, argued about what to hang on the walls. There was no villain in her story, just two good people who had slowly, imperceptibly, grown in different directions until they were standing on opposite sides of a chasm they didn't know how to cross. "It was a death by 1,000 tiny concessions," she said, her eyes distant. "One day you wake up and realize you've sanded down all your own edges to fit into a space that's no longer shaped like you. And the worst part is, she'd done the same. We had become two polite, considerate strangers who shared a bed." Her story wasn't a tragedy, but a quiet, aching melancholy. It was a different kind of heartbreak, the slow erosion of love rather than its violent demolition. It made her infinitely more real to me. She wasn't just a pillar of patient strength. She was a woman who understood loss, who had her own ghosts. It made her kindness feel less like an innate, saintly quality, and more like a conscious choice, forged in her own quiet fires. "So I left," she concluded with a soft sigh. "Packed my books and my drawing table and left. It was the hardest and the kindest thing we could do for each other." "That takes a lot of strength," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Or a lot of cowardice. Depends on the day you ask me." She gave me another small, sad smile. She pushed off the counter and turned back to the sauce. "Anyway, the cat went with her. I miss him more than I miss her. Most days." Her attempt at levity was a thin veil over the hurt. We were silent for a moment. I finished chopping the tomatoes and moved to scrape them into the pot. We both reached for the salt shaker on the shelf at the same time. Her hand, warm and firm, covered mine. The contact was like a lit match dropped on a trail of gasoline. Every nerve ending in my body screamed to life. I could feel the texture of her skin against mine, the slight pressure of her fingers. Her scent, sandalwood, bergamot, and now the faint savory aroma of garlic, filled my senses. I snatched my hand back as if I'd been burned, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Sorry," I mumbled, staring at the cutting board. "It's okay," she said, her voice a little rough. "All yours?" She stepped back, giving me space, but the kitchen suddenly felt impossibly small. The air was charged, thick with everything we weren't saying. I dumped the tomatoes into the pot, my movements jerky. I could feel her eyes on me, and I knew with a terrifying certainty that she had felt it too. The fragile trust between us had just been complicated by a spark of something far more dangerous. Life settled into a new humming tension. The accidental touches stopped, replaced by a hyper-awareness of proximity. We gave each other a wide berth in the hallway. We were meticulously careful not to be in the kitchen at the same time. The easy camaraderie we'd found was gone, smothered under the weight of that one moment. It was excruciating. I missed her. I missed the quiet company, the low murmur of her voice, the simple comfort of her presence. Now her presence was a constant, low-grade ache of longing. My mind had become a catalog of Lena, the way she bit her lower lip when she was concentrating on a drawing, the sound of her soft, throaty laugh when she was on the phone with her sister, The faded university sweatshirt she wore on lazy Sundays, the fabric worn thin over the elbows. I was obsessed. Every thought seemed to lead back to her. It was terrifying. I had just clawed my way out of the wreckage of one woman, and now my foolish broken heart was trying to wander into the path of another. One rainy Friday night, we found ourselves on the couch again, a silent truce declared against the misery of the weather. We were watching some mindless action movie, the kind with lots of explosions and terrible one-liners. We had a bowl of popcorn between us on the cushion, a carefully established buffer zone. But as the movie went on, as the whiskey I'd poured myself began to warm my veins, I started to relax. I felt a ghost of my old self, the one who could be playful and sarcastic, emerge from the shadows. The hero on screen delivered a line so cheesy, so painfully earnest, that I snorted. "Oh, come on, nobody talks like that." Lena glanced at me, a smile playing on her lips. "I don't know. I think it's kind of sweet." "It's ridiculous," I said, grabbing a handful of popcorn. "It's emotionally manipulative dialogue designed to make you overlook the gaping plot holes." She laughed, a real throaty laugh that made my stomach do a slow, lazy flip. "You're overthinking it, Chloe. Just enjoy the explosions." "I can't. My brain is a finely tuned instrument of criticism and cynicism." I was being deliberately performative, enjoying the banter, enjoying the way her eyes lit up when she was amused. I felt a surge of giddy confidence, a reckless, whiskey-fueled bravery. I looked at her, at the way the lamplight cast a warm glow on her skin, at the curve of her smiling lips, and something inside me broke free of its cage. "You'd better be careful," I said, my voice dropping into a conspiratorial, teasing whisper. "Keep laughing at my pain like that, and you'll have to kiss me just to shut me up." The words were out before I could stop them. They hung in the air between us, shimmering and dangerous. I expected her to laugh it off, to throw a piece of popcorn at me, to return the banter. She did none of those things. The smile vanished from her face. The light in her eyes didn't disappear, but it changed, intensified. She just stopped and looked at me, her dark gaze searching mine. The playful atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a silence so profound I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. The space between us on the couch, once a safe buffer, now felt like a supercharged vacuum pulling us in. The hero on the screen was probably saving the world, but my world had shrunk to the 18 inches separating my mouth from hers. After a lifetime, she finally spoke, her voice quiet and low, stripped of all humor. "Don't joke about that, Chloe." The sound of my name on her lips, spoken with such raw seriousness, was like a splash of cold water. It wasn't an admonishment. It wasn't anger. It was a plea, a warning. It was the sound of a woman who was taking me at my word, who was seeing straight through the flippant joke to the desperate truth cowering behind it. I had been playing with matches, and she was gently, firmly, telling me the whole house was flammable. My bravado crumbled into dust, leaving me exposed and trembling. I had teased her, expecting a playful shove, and instead, she had held up a mirror and shown me the depth of my own terrifying desire. The aftermath of that night was a cold, silent war. We retreated to our separate trenches, the doors to our bedrooms firmly closed. The apartment, which had started to feel like a shared space, a potential home, reverted to being just a property, two separate leases under one roof. The silence was worse than the early days of my arrival. Then, it had been my choice, my defensive wall. Now, it was a mutual, agonizing construction, built brick by brick with stolen glances and unspoken words. Every time we passed in the hallway, the air crackled with a static charge. I could feel the gravitational pull of her, and I could feel her resisting it with equal force. My work suffered. I'd stare at a branding project on my screen, moving pixels around aimlessly, my mind entirely consumed by the woman in the next room. What was she doing? Was she drawing? Was she thinking about me? The question was a constant humming torture. I'd hear the floorboards creak as she moved around her room, and my entire body would tense, my breath catching in my throat. I started timing my trips to the kitchen for when I knew she'd be on a run, just to avoid the possibility of an encounter. The smell of her shampoo lingered in the bathroom, a daily reminder of her presence, of her body, of the intimacy we were both so desperately avoiding. Sandalwood and bergamot. It was the scent of my own private madness. One afternoon, I was coming out of my room, lost in thought, and she was walking down the hall from the kitchen, a mug in her hand. We were on a collision course. There was a moment of frantic, clumsy shuffling as we both tried to sidestep each other and ended up moving in the same direction. We collided, not hard, but enough to make her stumble. The mug slipped from her grasp. Instinct took over. I reached out, my hands finding her arms to steady her, while my other hand shot out and miraculously caught the mug just before it hit the floor. Hot coffee sloshed over my fingers, the sting barely registering. We were frozen there in the narrow hallway, my hands gripping her upper arms, her body pressed lightly against mine. Her eyes were wide, inches from my own. I could see the flecks of gold in the deep brown of her irises. I could feel the warmth of her breath on my cheek. The world narrowed to this single point of contact. Her arms were firm, solid beneath my hands. The fabric of her t-shirt was soft. I could feel the frantic beating of my own heart, and I was sure she could feel it too. Time stretched and became molasses slow. All I had to do was lean forward, just an inch. That's all it would take. The thought was so powerful, so overwhelming it was a physical force. My body wanted to move, to close the gap, to end this exquisite torment. She started, her voice a strained whisper. The sound broke the spell. I blinked, dropping my hands from her arms as if they'd been burned. I stepped back, putting a chasm of at least 2 feet between us. "Sorry," I croaked, my voice unrecognizable. I thrust the mug back at her. "You almost dropped this." "Thanks," she said, taking it from me. Her fingers were trembling slightly. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She stared at the mug as if it held the secrets of the universe. I have a deadline." She practically fled down the hallway and disappeared into her room, the click of her door shutting echoing like a gunshot in the silent apartment. I stood there, my hands still tingling from the heat of the coffee and the impossible warmth of her skin, my entire body humming with a frustrated, desperate energy. This couldn't go on. We were living on a knife's edge, and one of us was going to fall. I couldn't take it anymore. The silence was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. We couldn't live like this, circling each other like two wounded animals, terrified to get too close. Something had to break. I walked down the hall, my socked feet silent on the floorboards, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I stood in front of her closed door for a long moment, my hand hovering over the wood. This was it. I could knock and change everything, or I could walk away and condemn us to this agonizing limbo indefinitely. I took a deep breath and knocked. 3 soft raps. A moment passed. I heard a soft shuffling from inside, and then the door opened. Lena stood there, her hair pulled back, a smudge of charcoal on her cheek. She looked tired, her eyes shadowed. She was wearing that faded university sweatshirt I loved so much. "Hey," she said, her voice wary. "Can we talk?" I asked, the words rushing out. "I can't do this anymore, not talking. It's making me crazy." She looked at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she sighed, a deep, weary sound, and stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in." Her room was neat, organized, but full of life. Books were stacked on every surface, and sketches were pinned to a large corkboard on the wall. It smelled like her, sandalwood and paper and charcoal. I stood awkwardly in the middle of the room while she closed the door behind us, the soft click sealing us in. "I'm sorry," I began, wringing my hands, "for what I said the other night on the couch. It was stupid. It was a joke and it was out of line, and I want us to go back to how it was, to being friends." The words tasted like ash in my mouth. Friends. It was the biggest lie I'd ever told. She was watching me, her arms crossed over her chest, her head tilted slightly. That assessing look was back in her eyes, the one that saw right through me. "Chloe," she said, and her voice was so gentle it almost broke me. "Stop." I stopped. "The problem wasn't the joke," she said, her gaze unwavering, pinning me to the spot. "The problem is that I wanted to." The air left my lungs in a rush. Her words, a simple, devastating confession, dismantled every one of my remaining defenses. The truth of it, the sheer, terrifying relief of it, buckled my knees. All this time, I had thought I was alone in this, a freak obsessing over my kind, patient roommate. But she had been in it with me, trapped in the same silent, charged space. I don't know who moved first. Maybe we both did. It was a mutual surrender, a closing of the impossible distance between us. One moment I was standing in the middle of her room, and the next I was in her arms, her hands tangled in my hair, my face buried in the soft cotton of her sweatshirt. And then her mouth was on mine. It wasn't a gentle, tentative kiss. It was a collision. It was desperate and hungry, a release of weeks of pent-up tension, of unspoken longing, of fear and hope, and a terrifying, exhilarating recognition. It was the taste of coffee and charcoal and the unique, undeniable taste of her. Her lips were soft, demanding. I opened my mouth to her, a gasp and an invitation, and her tongue met mine. It was a kiss that said everything we hadn't been able to say. It said, "I see you. I want you. Finally." My hands went to her face, my thumbs tracing the line of her jaw, the curve of her cheek. I wanted to memorize the feel of her. She pulled me closer, one hand sliding down my back, pressing me against the length of her body. I could feel the solid warmth of her, the strength in her frame, the frantic beat of her heart mirroring my own. In the middle of that world-altering kiss, a shrill, intrusive sound pierced our bubble. My phone, which I'd left on her nightstand, was ringing. We broke apart, breathing hard, our foreheads resting against each other. The screen lit up the dim room with a name that made my blood run cold. Jessica, my sister, the self-appointed arbiter of my life choices, the one who always referred to Sarah as my friend, her voice dripping with a condescending pity I couldn't stand. The phone continued its shrill summons, a siren from the outside world, a world of judgment and complication. Lena's eyes flicked to the screen, then back to mine. It was a test, a choice. Do I answer? Do I let that voice, that world in? Do I step back from this precipice and return to the safety of my fortress? I looked at Lena, at her beautiful, serious face, her lips slightly swollen from my kiss, her eyes full of a question. And I knew with absolute clarity what I had to do. I reached over, my hand shaking slightly, and silenced the call. I didn't decline it. I just silenced it. A small, definitive act of defiance. A choice. I chose her. I chose this. I turned my back on the ringing phone and pulled her face back to mine, sealing my decision with another kiss. Softer this time, but deeper, full of a promise I was finally ready to make. We didn't talk for a long time after that. Words felt inadequate, clumsy. Instead, we communicated through touch, through breath, through presence. We ended up sitting on her bed, my back against the wall, her curled into my side, my arm wrapped around her shoulders. Her head rested in the crook of my neck, and I could feel her soft, even breathing against my skin. I threaded my fingers through her hair, marveling at the texture, the softness. The frantic energy of the kiss had settled into a deep, humming calm. It felt less like a beginning and more like an arrival, as if some part of me had been traveling toward this moment for a very long time. The next morning, I woke up in my own bed, the scent of her still on my skin. For a panicked moment, I wondered if I had dreamed it all. But then I saw her sweatshirt, the one she'd been wearing, draped over the chair in the corner of my room. A tangible piece of evidence. A silent promise. I found her in the kitchen making coffee. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, catching the dust motes dancing in the air and illuminating her profile. She turned as I entered, and a slow, shy smile spread across her face. It was a different kind of smile than I'd ever seen from her before. It was open, vulnerable, and utterly breathtaking. "Morning," she said, her voice a little husky. "Morning," I replied, my own voice soft. The silence that fell between us was comfortable, easy. The tension was gone, replaced by a tender, shimmering newness. She handed me my favorite mug, already filled with coffee. It was a simple domestic act, one she had performed dozens of times before, but today it felt monumental. It felt like a vow. "About last night?" I started, needing to give voice to the change, to make it real. "Yeah," she said, leaning against the counter, cradling her own mug. "About last night. My sister." I trailed off, not sure how to explain the complex knot of my family. "You don't have to explain," she said, her eyes kind. "I get it or I don't, but it's your stuff. We can deal with it." We. The word hung in the sunlit kitchen, beautiful and terrifying in its implications. We can deal with it. It was the most hopeful word I had heard in years. For so long, it had just been I. I had to deal with the breakup. I had to deal with the move. I had to deal with my grief. But now, there was a we. We acknowledged that we didn't know what this was. Not yet. It was too new, too fragile to be named. But we were in it, together. That was enough. A week later, we were on the small balcony that overlooked the quiet, tree-lined street. A cool autumn breeze rustled the leaves, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. Lena was in a lounge chair, reading, a pair of glasses perched on her nose that I'd never seen before. They made her look studious and impossibly lovely. I was sitting on the floor, my back against the brick wall, a new sketchbook she'd given me open on my lap. I wasn't very good, but I was trying. I was sketching the gnarled branches of the old oak tree across the street, focusing on the lines, the shadows, the intricate patterns of the bark. I hadn't spoken to my sister yet. My ex hadn't been completely exorcised from my memory. The world outside our apartment door was still the same complicated, messy place it had always been. None of my problems had magically disappeared. But they no longer felt insurmountable. They were just life. And I wasn't facing it alone anymore. I looked up from my sketchbook and watched Lena. She was completely absorbed in her book, her brow furrowed in concentration. A strand of her hair had escaped its tie, and she tucked it behind her ear without looking up. A feeling swelled in my chest, so warm and expansive it felt like my ribs might crack. It wasn't the frantic, desperate infatuation I'd felt for Sarah. This was quieter, steadier. It was a feeling of profound peace, of rightness. It was hope. She must have felt me looking at her, because she lowered her book and met my gaze over the top of her glasses. She didn't say anything. She just smiled. It was a small, quiet smile, but it held the entire world in it. I smiled back, a real, unforced smile that reached my eyes. I had come to this apartment seeking a fortress, a place to hide. But instead, I had found a home. I had chosen to be seen, and in doing so, had found a strength I never knew I possessed. Have you ever had to choose between the safety of your walls and the terrifying, beautiful possibility of letting someone in? If you've ever faced that choice, or if this story touched you, please give it a like, subscribe for more stories, and share your own experiences in the comments below.